Hello and welcome to the Spotlight. I'm Kaveh Taghvai. Investigations into claims of abuse by British troops in Iraq have closed. Not a single prosecution is being brought. This is when thousands of complaints have been made. How then can there be no accountability? In this edition of the Spotlight, we will look at how British soldiers and in turn the UK government have gotten away with committing crimes in Iraq. Has the Iraqi government been pressured not to do so? Or was there an agreement like immunity from prosecution preventing justice to be served? Just some of the questions we'll be asking in this edition of the Spotlight. But first, let's get more about this from our correspondent, Saeed Pourreza, who joins us from London. Saeed, just fill us in about this report and the explanation that was given.
You raised very good questions there, Kaveh, but this was an investigation that was conducted by the Service Police Legacy Investigations, otherwise known as the SPLI, into claims by Iraqi civilians of serious criminal behavior by British troops that allegedly happened between the year 2003, at the time of the U.S.-led invasion of Iraq, up until 2009, the post-invasion occupation years that the British troops were part of. Prior to that, there had been another investigation conducted by the Iraq Historic Allegations Team, IHAD, if I'm pronouncing it right. That was closed down, and some nearly 1,300 allegations were taken up by the SPLI, the Service Police Legacy Investigations, into those allegations against British troops while they were in Iraq. The UK Defense Secretary Ben Wallace wrote in a statement to the country's parliament this week, in which, among other things, he admitted that, quote, there had been some shocking and shameful incidents that happened in Iraq. In recent years, some 400 former Iraqi prisoners contacted the Berlin-based European Center for Constitutional and Human Rights and public rights lawyers, rather, in Birmingham, Northern England, denouncing their abuse, grave abuse, and mistreatment and humiliation at the hands of British troops while they were in Iraq. And those allegations include a rape to torture to mock executions, among other atrocities. But of note is the 2017 UK High Court ruling that accused British troops of having violated the Geneva Conventions during their military presence in Iraq by regularly abusing civilians and detainees. 2 years later, in 2019, it was revealed that the British government and the military had tried to cover up war crimes in Iraq, and that they had no intention of prosecuting any soldier. At the time, the International Criminal Court, the ICC, raised the possibility of launching its own probe into those allegations. But late last year, I believe it was in December 2020, that probe was dropped as announced by the ICC prosecutor, Fatou Bensouda. But 2 years later, Kaveh, those revelations that the British government and military had no intention of prosecuting any soldier, despite the myriad claims by Iraqi former detainees and civilians against them, have come to be true.
Thank you very much for that. We appreciate it. You raised some points here that I missed that I'm going to ask from our guest. We appreciate that, Saeed. So let me introduce our guest for this edition of the Spotlight. We have filmmaker and activist Fero, who joins us from London. Also joining us, radio host and journalist DeBar, who joins us from New York. All right, it's great to have both of you on this edition of the Spotlight. DeBar, I'm going to start with you and just simply get a reaction, if I may, on these investigations into claims of abuse by British troops in Iraq that have now been closed without a single prosecution.
You can sum them up in a single word. That word is impunity. It's an interesting fabric that sort of contextualizes this. Today is the 10th anniversary of the murder of Muammar Gaddafi by proxies of the United States, conducting an illegal war that was done without the authorization of either the UN Security Council or the U.S. Congress. You have Colin Powell passing away, who was responsible on February 5th of 2003 for lying to the world about evidence that there were weapons of mass destruction in Iraq, after being refuted by the members of the Security Council in November of 2002, when the U.S. sought a resolution authorizing a war on Iraq. So the U.S. conducted a war on Iraq along with the U.K. and France and a few other of the coalition of the willing, as they called them, that killed at least 1 million to 1.5 million Iraqis. Each and every one of those deaths is a war crime, and no one is being prosecuted for any of that. In fact, they're holding funerals for Colin Powell as if he were a hero of some kind. And we've had a history of these things that have happened, between, I don't know how far you want to go back, when Columbus arrived here until last Tuesday. You've had the destruction of Iraq, the destruction of Libya, the interdiction of an ambassador from Venezuela going to Iran 2 years ago that, has suddenly been dragged to the United States this past Monday for crimes that have nothing to do with international law and are in direct violation, if you're talking about Geneva Accords, by the way, of the 1963 treaty, I think, on diplomats. The U.S. is a law. It could be indicted under its own RICO law if there were not such a vast criminal conspiracy here that all of the prosecutors and courts are in on it.
Indeed. We're going to get to one of those points that has to deal with the Roman statute. But first, Fero, in terms of the sheer numbers of the crimes committed here, and the independent investigator, from what we understand, looked into the claims of these, what it is called war crimes between 2003 and 2009. And then it said all but one of the thousands of complaints had been dropped. So you have thousands of complaints, one dropped, not a single prosecution. It just doesn't go with logic here.
Well, it goes with the logic of the UK government and how the UK government deals not just with its international aggressions, but with its national aggressions. Within the UK, there's a serious problem of police violence leading to deaths. Again, no prosecutions, despite thousands of deaths. And when we go outside the UK, and the force of the British government, the ex-empires, put in the different situations that my colleagues just outlined, it's just a catalogue of abuses and murder and mass murder across nations. And so this history of British imperialism, this history of the British Empire, is a history which goes back, hundreds and hundreds of years and will never stop. And I think it shouldn't really be a surprise that this so-called independent investigator has come to this conclusion, because that's the exact role of the investigator. I think people are absolutely delusional if they think that these investigators, whether investigating national crimes or international crimes, are actually going to do anything which puts the guilty parties where they should be. And then, if that was to happen, if it were that there was evidence presented, and of course we know the evidence is there, and it's there in plain sight. We know that evidence is there. If that were presented, the question is which court would you take that to? Because the courts themselves are not independent. So we have a situation where Britain and other countries kill with impunity, and the question has to be is what is the international community going to do about it? That's the major question. We cannot keep coming to these situations where impunity, whether it's the US, whether it's the UK, whether it's France, or any of the so-called Western nations, are in this position where people are expecting the aggressors to actually come to kind of some justice for the people that have been killed, whether it's during war or within the nation states.
Well, Don DeBar, I'm trying to figure out the ICC position here. The definition of a war crime. Let me go at it at you with this angle. The ICC prosecutor has said about the crimes in Iraq, it found that there are reasonable basis to believe that members of the UK armed forces did commit war crimes. It cited willful killing, torture, inhumane, cruel treatment, outrages upon personal dignity, rape and other forms of sexual violence. But yet you have the ICC prosecutor recently to have closed the preliminary inquiry. That doesn't make sense. It goes against what they have cited. And of course, unlike the U.S., the UK is a signatory to the ICC. So can you please explain this to us if you can?
Well, you have to start, at the beginning. You correctly mentioned that unlike the U.S., the UK is at least a signatory to the Rome Statute, which enables the ICC. The U.S. does not recognize the jurisdiction of the ICC over itself, although it willingly refers just about anybody that it has a problem with to the ICC for prosecution, and in fact will enforce judgments of the ICC with military power or threaten to. By the way, the U.S. also treats the ICJ that way, just about any other international organs that might actually mitigate U.S. power on the global stage, if that happened by some chance through their own operations, which is highly unlikely the way these things are designed. But, you have to go to the very beginning of this. It is illegal for a nation to make war on another nation if it does not have the approval of the UN Security Council, if any of those nations are signatories to the original UN Charter, and if it's been adopted. That happened with the U.S. as a charter member of the UN, and was approved by the U.S. Senate in the 1940s. Consequently, U.S. involvement in Iraq from the beginning and UK involvement in Iraq from the beginning was illegal. And under the Nuremberg standards, which would then apply, each and every death consequent, intentionally or not, to either U.S. military action there or the condoning of U.S. military action there by the media or public officials, or any act facilitating that, is an individual war crime. And by the way, the penalty for that, there's a death penalty for that. No one is going to prosecute any of these people, and that's why I started with the word impunity. And we might as well bookend it with that, because that's the problem. And until the world puts an end to that impunity, until the world sees that the major contradiction in all international relations is U.S. and UK and EU imperialism, then this is going to continue until it eats our species.
Well, now that you mention it that way, when you say, Don DeBar, and I'm going to ask you, Ken Fero, this question. Don DeBar says the world needs to. I mean, that's what we say on PRESSTV when it comes to the Palestinian cause, when it comes to Israel violating international rules. The world needs to do something. The international community needs to stop the bloodshed in Yemen, for example. But, that's just not happening. The contradictions here is my focus right now. Ken Fero, Defense Secretary Ben Wallace, let's zoom in on him. The vast majority of the more than 140,000 members, he said, of our armed forces who served in Iraq did so honorably. Yet he said it is sadly clear from all the investigations that the UK conducted that some shocking and shameful incidents did happen in Iraq. I mean, it just goes against what he says from one sentence to another.
Well, of course, but that shouldn't be a surprise to us, because the role of ministers is to twist the truth. And the fundamental question here is quite a philosophical one, in a sense, is that when we have this term, for example, war crimes, many people believe that war itself is a crime. So the very fact that nations could have agreed to a kind of rules of war is something which is fundamentally needs to be challenged. We cannot be in this position of wondering why aggressors are not taking care of the business that they're in, which is to come to some kind of conclusion where a crime is being committed, a crime against a nation, a crime against an individual, a war crime. We're asking the very same people to commit those crimes to then come and deliver some justice to the people who they've killed. It's quite a ridiculous situation for us to be in. And I think we have to really start to look at what are the possibilities for international solidarity and cooperation. And I think we have to actually question, as well as the term war crimes, what does it mean when we talk about the international community? Because the international community generally means state powers and the organs they set up to represent themselves and their interests. And really what we should be talking about is how people internationally can work together, can challenge nation states and to challenge what those nation states are doing. And I think we have to really look at, for example, what's been happening across the world in terms of the changes in the Middle East, the uprisings in the Middle East, in terms of the concerns around race and gender and environment that we've seen across the West and across the global South as well. All these forces of youth who are looking at the world that we live in and are saying, we do not accept the parameters that have been set up before. We do not accept the Oslo Accords, we do not accept the ICC, we do not accept any of these functionaries who basically have just been there to serve the interests of capital. And when it comes to war, it's really an economic question. The Americans didn't lose in Afghanistan. Militarily, they lost, and they lost in terms of the defeat of the image of the United States, but fundamentally, the United States made a lot of money out of the war in Afghanistan. And so we have to look at how we work together across nations, across international movements, to challenge these organizations and to, frankly, dismantle them. I don't think they can be improved. They were built on corruption, and they were built on agreements between nation states who really had no interest in solving so-called war crimes. They were just interested in having this veneer of civilization, and everyone can see that if we have Palestine, if we have Yemen, if we have Syria, if we have, the destruction we see in the Middle East, the destruction and the continuing abuse of Africa, we can go on and on and on. All of this has to stop. So this, the minister and the war crimes issue is something that has to be challenged, but we have to look at it in relation to how man is basically developing at the moment, and it's one of utter, complete destruction.
The question for you, Don DeBar, when you said the world, is still lingering in my mind, and I need to approach you from another angle on this. And I don't want to get, because we don't have too much time, to get into too much of a discussion on what I'm about to propose in the form of a question. And it has to deal with Israel and Iran, because just the past day or so, Israel has said, we are going to put aside $1.5 billion to stop Iran from going after the nuclear weapon, so we can set aside drones, bombs, all types of military hardware for attacking Iran's nuclear facilities. So when you hear something like that, first of all, it's surprising, of course, and shocking in another sense, that you have Israel actually saying, hey, we're putting aside money because we might attack Iran's nuclear facilities. How do you stop things like that from happening? When we say the world needs to, and then we have Israel making that type of assessments on Iran, which is an act of war in a sense. They're putting aside money for it. Again, I don't want to get into a discussion about Iran, Israel, whether it has the right to think that way or not, but to stop the idea of war is what I'm getting at here.
I understand. Well, I mean, first of all, you have the same problem here. That Israel is committing a per se violation of the Nuremberg principles by threatening Iran with war. And I would say appropriating the money to target Iran's infrastructure is threatening an act of war, because actually hitting the infrastructure is an act of war, and threatening to do it is actually an act of war, because it forces a response and a reallocation of resources inside of Iran. Iran is now a permanent member of the SCO, the Shanghai Cooperative Organization, which means that it is possible that it can integrate economic activity with some of the largest economies in Asia and hence in the world, regardless of the attempt of the U.S. to isolate them. I suspect, if history is any guide, that there will be at some point some acknowledgement that it's necessary to have military cooperation as well among the members of a bloc that would be a world player. And so hopefully Israel, looking down the barrel not just at Iran, but ultimately at China and Russia as being involved in the response, might chill their behavior and their sponsors' behavior also, although the U.S. has been pretty blind, essentially, to the reality of possible global destruction when it feels adventurous. And Israel is acting as an agent of the United States here. Make no doubt about that.
Okay. Final question to you, Ken Fero. So we get to no single prosecution, but there's one figure that has been asked by many to be prosecuted over the years, especially when the Iraq War broke out. And I should say more than one figure, really two, that stand out. Tony Blair and George Bush Jr. What do you think? Shouldn't they be the ones to be prosecuted?
Well, most certainly, but I don't think it's just down to those two figures, although symbolically it'd be important to put them on trial for the war crimes which they committed, and for the destruction they committed, and for the continuing destruction this has caused across the Middle East and beyond. But I don't think it's enough to take these figureheads. I think it's the complete system. It's the politicians that voted to go to war. It's the media in the UK that sabered the rattles to go to war. So it's the whole system which has justified the unjustifiable, and that's what we've had not just in Iraq but in many places across the Middle East. And I do have hope in the younger generation. I think there is a very strong feeling within the younger generation that there has to be change. What kind of change that is, when that change comes, I don't know, but we know in the history of the world that, you know, when people unite against tyranny, then tyranny does fall, and we have to bear that in mind, and we have to make these alliances at an economic, cultural, political level.
Great. We're going to leave that as a seed for thought there. Thank you very much. We're fresh out of time. That was Ken Fero, filmmaker and activist from London. Many thanks, Ken. And Don DeBar, it's great to see you from New York, radio host and journalist there. And at the top of the Spotlight, we had our correspondent, Saeed Pourreza. With that, we come to the end of this edition of the Spotlight. Thanks for tuning in. From me, Kaveh Taghvai, and the team, it's goodbye until next time.